people. Well, this song is dedicated to the children of Africa. We're here to say that no child should be born with HIV in Africa. And if you believe with me, rise on your feet and let's sing together. Yo, 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 yo. About our children infected with HIV. Some are orphaned and they don't know what to do. Who will fight for their rights? Who will really care about them? That's why we sing Pata. We care for our children. Whoa, whoa. Oh, yeah, 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 yeah.
Good afternoon, everyone. Thank you, everyone, for joining us for the PATA-Real webinar. For those who have been with us, you remember that this is now the fifth of our quarterly webinar series. My name is Agnes Ronan. I am the head of programs at PATA, and I am joined today by 4 presenters from Mozambique, Uganda, Zimbabwe, and Zambia. And I will introduce you to each of the presenters as they come along to do their presentations. Also with us, we have 2 HIV pediatricians and experts in HIV treatment who need no introduction, and that is Dr. Nandita Sugadi, who is a member of the PATA Technical Advisory Panel. And we also have Dr. Mo Archery, who is from King Edward VIII Hospital and the University of KwaZulu-Natal here in South Africa. So these are our 2 experts for us today. They'll be helping us understand and as we listen to the cases, unpack the cases, and help us to learn from the cases being presented today. So, for those who've never been on a PATA-Real webinar, I'm going just to start by explaining what the PATA-Real webinars are about. So many of our health providers, as you know, work in underserved facilities, often do not have access to the most recent guidance or expert advice. They just struggle along and they do what they can do in their own corners. They have very little opportunities to connect with other peers and to share and learn from each other's experiences. So the idea behind our real webinars is to deliberately create that space for our health providers to share and learn together from real cases, and also to have advice from our experts. So all our cases were prepared by health providers. They will be presenting the cases today. And I would just at this moment really like to stop and say thank you to all our health providers. We know you have very busy lives. You've got work in very busy clinics, and it's not easy to put a presentation together, to put a case together and a presentation together, and then to take the time to be with us on this platform today. So thank you to you all for all the hard work that you've put in here. So just to delve straight into today's webinar. So today's webinar focuses on transitioning of children and adolescents living with HIV to DTG or pDTG from other regimens. The cases today will highlight some of the challenges and some of the questions and considerations many of you are facing in the rapid rollout of pDTG and in transitioning regimens to make sure that our children living with HIV receive the best available first and second line HIV treatment as soon as possible. We have 4 cases to be presented from 4 different countries, as I've mentioned. And case 1 will be presented, followed by a discussion with our expert panel. Case 2 and 3 are very similar, so we decided to group those 2 together. So they'll be presented one after the other, and then the expert panel will come in to comment on the cases. And then the last case for us, we saw really as more of a best practice example. And And if we have, and I think what we'd really like to do at the end of the session, if we have time to link this to our PATA demonstration video on pDTG transition. So I will now call on Chieza Chivesa, who is a senior counselor from Morgan Star Clinic in Zimbabwe. And Chieza will be followed by Lydia Namuli, and Lydia is a nurse midwife from Congo Clinic in Uganda. Please go ahead.
Yes. My case is of a 25-year-old male who was diagnosed with HIV at the age of 10. On the 15th of June, 2007, he self-transferred himself from Harare in 2013 while he's on first-line therapy. Client is an orphan, his mother passed away and his father abandoned him after he remarried. At that point, the client left Harare and went to stay in a rural area of Mashingo with his paternal grandmother. He is currently wandering about without a permanent place to stay. Substance abuse is suspected. The client collects this medication as a visitor at different clinics due to lack of permanent residence. Clinical evaluation, client was in a mentally euphoric state at presentation. Baseline regimen was initiated on the 30th of June 2007. That was Sidofdin, Lamvudin, and Nevirapine. Then in August 2017, client treatment was changed to tenofovir, lamivudine, and efavirenz as per guidelines. Client transitioned to second-line regimen in August 2021, abacavir, lamivudine, and dolutegravir due to high viral loads. Then he was referred for after a viral load of 4,252 copies per microliter, dated 4 May 2020. The client was referred for EAC sessions in enhanced adherence counseling. Then, after 28 days, was given another visit. Then, after another 4 weeks, he was also given a review date for EAC session. On the second session, it was a followed up in the community, but we did not find him. When at his residence, and his grandmother told us that he has gone to a nearby business center. We followed him and we find him already intoxicated with substance abuse. Then I said the client was referred for enhanced adherence counseling. First session was conducted at the site, and the second session was conducted in community. That is peer support. During EAC issues which were addressed were emotional trauma from neglect abuse, then cognitive challenges. The client admits to forgetting taking his medication, but claimed to have any issues with any substance abuse. In 2021, the client was referred to a doctor and changed to second line, that is abacavir, lamivudine, and dolutegravir. Then, due to the client's lack of information, due to the client's lack of permanent residence, there is no fixed location for collecting medication. Client denies drug abuse, but we suspected drug use, and no fixed residence makes the retention in care and tracking a challenge. The questions are: is this treatment failure or poor adherence due to suspected drug use? 2, was it ideal to change it to second line as now DTG regimen if the persistent high viral load is mostly likely poor adherence and transient lifestyle? Third, what is the recommended guidance in the event of suspected drug use and continue treatment protocol as per normal? drug use and at interaction, what to advise? Thank you.
Thank you so much, Chieza. And we will move on to Lydia's presentation. And the idea is that our experts will respond to Lydia and Chieza's questions together at the same time after Lydia's presentation. So Lydia, please go ahead.
Okay, thank you. Can you hear me? Lydia and
I think we're having sound problems. So would it be okay if we get Dr. Margaret to present on your behalf?
yeah, it's okay. It's
Thank you,
okay,
Lydia,
then
and I'm
you can
terribly
go
sorry
from
about that. Thank you so much. Okay, Dr. Margaret, would you like to take over for us, please?
Okay, Lydia, thank you very much. Okay, so to continue, Lydia, the presentation says SG tested HIV positive on the 17th of December 2019 at Manyi Health Center, Health Center 3, and was initiated on ART and later transferred to Mpongo Health Center 3, which is closer to his home. So on examination, SG was 23 kilograms. He had a height, he has a height of 123 centimeters. Visibly, they saw stunting and wasting. He had repeated infections, especially diarrhea and worm infestation. He has the developmental delays. He has speech impediment and has only started school last year. This year. He was also found to have moderate malnutrition, inadequate stimulation, and psychosocial care support issues. So basically, the facility realized that there were issues of neglect. On further examination at Manyi Health Center, SG was initiated on ART on the 17th of December 2019 on Abacaville, 3TC, and Lopinaville. He remains on the same regimen, and these were his viral load results. On the 9th of December 2020, his viral load was 2,320 copies per mil. On the 20th of November 2021, it was at 1,188 copies per mil. Further result, the other viral load results are still not yet available. And because he was failing, a home visit was undertaken to explore his home conditions and challenges around adherence, and to offer also index testing for the other 5 cousins that were talked about earlier. So the grandmother says that she provides treatment regularly, but as there is no TV or phone or watch for reminder, treatment has not been on time at the same time as the health providers have told her. So the grandmother, the biological parents, the paternal uncle, and the class teacher were made aware of the child's status. The father is bedridden and the mother remarried. Index testing was done on the 5 cousins who all tested negative. The father's status was already known and he's in care. Enhanced adherence sessions were also conducted both at the facility and during home visits. So the key challenges and questions that Lydia Namuli has is that, can one be initiated on DTG-based regimen before being virally suppressed? Can one be transitioned to DTG if one suspects there is already poor adherence? What should one do? What to do if viral load is still high when we are not able to do resistance testing? What are the next steps to provide the necessary care? And the lessons that she's learned is that broken families, neglect, and poverty impact on adherence. Thank you very much. Over.
Thank you very much, Dr. Margaret and Lydia. So I'm going to hand over to Dr. Nandita Sugari and Dr. Archery to respond to our 2 cases.
Yeah, no, thank you very much for these cases. And I think, ultimately, it does reflect in the difficulties we have, especially with patients, where there's difficult home circumstances that make it very difficult to take the treatment. I think just to bring some points that picked up. I think the first the first patient. I think obviously we all recognize that there's obviously quite significant difficulty in this patient with taking their treatment, and I do suspect that the substance abuse may be worsening the situation with this patient. So with the other, I mean, just one comment is about really around on cycling of your NRTI backbone. So certainly, in terms of moving between different NRTIs, we want to make sure that we at least keep them on the same level of resistance profile for each level of the regimen that you're putting on this patient on. So in this kid, he was when he started on treatment, he was on AZT, 3TC, nevirapine, and then was switched to tenofovir, lamivudine, and favirenz. So in essence, they've changed. The NNRTI remained the same, but the NRTI changed. And if we look at, even without doing a resistance test in this patient, we would assume that with the nevirapine, he would have received, would have acquired either K103N or a Y181C mutation that gives you high-level resistance to both nevirapine and favirenz. So I'm not surprised that this patient, failed the TLD regimen as well. And then, then he was changed to abacavir 3TC, dolutegravir, and the one problem with the abacavir is that because he was on 3TC on the two previous regimens, he would have acquired a 184V mutation, which will give him both high-level resistance to 3TC, but also intermediate resistance to abacavir. So, without even doing any resistance profile on this patient, we would assume that he has got, high-level resistance to 3TC, intermediate resistance to abacavir, obviously would be fully susceptible to dolutegravir, and will be fully resistant to your NNRTIs, and potentially, because he has been on such a long duration of failing an NNRTI regimen, he will be resistant to your second-line NNRTIs as well, including rilpivirine and doravirine as well. So, one comment would be in terms of the regimen changes is that you potentially wouldn't want to change him back to abacavir because of the potential of having a low, the intermediate resistance to abacavir, and TLD or tenofovir, lamivudine, dolutegravir may have been a slightly better option for this patient. That said, I think the difficulty with this patient is really around getting the adherence right, and trying to ensure that there's consistency in terms of not only the treatment support, but also the care for this patient. Similarly, I think the second patient as well, I think identifies, again, this is a younger patient, but also, is having difficulty in terms of their ability to take their treatment, and that support system, especially with the elderly, supporter, it becomes extremely difficult. So, the one advantage of moving to a dolutegravir-based regimen in this patient is really around, moving from a twice daily, and especially if you're using lopinavir, ritonavir, you're going onto a twice daily regimen to a once daily regimen. So, especially with this low-level viremia, there may be potential benefit from going onto a dolutegravir-based regimen. But certainly, I think working with this family to see what are the potential issues that may be affecting his adherence, may be quite helpful for this kid. The other thing that I just wanted to comment about was it's really around this developmental delay. And reading between the lines, I'm assuming that this child has had some difficulty with schooling and other problems as well. And I think that affects the child also in terms of their ability to continue their treatment. And I think referring them to some sort of educational assessment and getting adequate support for that also goes a long way in terms of building self belief and also self-reliance for this patient. So Nandita, do you want to make any other comments?
Sure. No, thank you so much, Mo, and thank you to our colleagues from Uganda for putting, or from Zimbabwe for putting this case together. And I agree. I think it's really telling that these are sort of the challenging cases that we have. They're not so straightforward. They're not easily solved. And there are a lot of intertwining issues here that we need to address. I do want to point out, though, that I have to say that to our colleagues in Zimbabwe, that at least there's a recognition of the long history of neglect and the impact that this may have had on this young man's life, in addition to HIV. And I will point out that as much as we're sharing a history that spans over 10 years. This child is actually now a young man of 25. But he somehow still, we have his story. And so that means at some level, we have retained him in care. Not well, and he's not coming back frequently or to the same clinic, but at least we have a sense of what's happening in his life and what the real challenges are. I find it promising that not only was he able to come at least for one adherence session at the facility, but that there was an attempt made for peer outreach. And even though that may not have been successful yet, it's important that we keep trying with this young man. Our real worry with high viral load is that the virus will learn how to resist or develop resistance to the drugs. And we know that the drugs that he was initially started on, zidovudine, lamivudine, and nevirapine in particular, it's quite easy to develop resistance to nevirapine in particular. And so because he was failing on this regimen of ZLN for about 10 years, it's quite likely that he had developed resistance, some level of resistance to zidovudine and lamivudine, as well as resistance to nevirapine. Because again, we've learned over time that nevirapine and its sort of other, another NNRTI, efavirenz, which we used to use quite often in treatment, are very easy to become resistant to. And so in 2017, when he returned to care as an adult, he was switched to the regimen TLE, which at that time was the preferred adult regimen for first line. And in some sense, we knew he had been failing. We knew which regimen he had been failing. Our standard practice in the past had been, if you are failing on AZT, that you would switch to either tenofovir or abacavir, and vice versa. If you were failing on tenofovir or abacavir, that you would switch to AZT as the NRTI alongside 3TC. And things are starting to change now with the introduction of drugs that have a higher genetic barrier to resistance, meaning unlike nevirapine and efavirenz, which are the drugs we used to use more commonly, these drugs are much more difficult to develop resistance to. So I think it was a good idea when he was switched to a second line of ALD and introduced in sort of dolutegravir was started, because it is a very potent drug. And we have seen in some studies in adults that even if there is some NRTI resistance to tenofovir, that dolutegravir can still be active. Now, that said, I think there's still things that we can do to make sure that it's easier for him to take his medications. So right now, there are no widely available formulations of abacavir and lamivudine plus dolutegravir. So we have to give those separately. If we switched him as an adult to TLD, that's very possibly much easier for him to take, as it's a single tablet once daily regimen. But we also need to make sure that we're addressing his adherence and maximizing his exposure to the drugs that he's taking so that he will hopefully be able to suppress his viral load, despite the fact that he has had ongoing viral failure and likely developed a lot of resistance. And so a few things just to also add is, in addition to stress to making sure that he is on an easy to take regimen, is to continue the follow-up, is to recognize that this is a young man who has grown up with neglect, who has developmental delay, so may not be understanding the things the same way that another 25-year-old may be considering. And then this issue of substance abuse has really become a major challenge in our young people. Sometimes it's because of drug-drug interactions. Sometimes it's more a case of when you are under the influence of whether it's alcohol or whether it's other recreational drugs, you're not thinking clearly, and you may be doing things that you wouldn't do otherwise, like missing your meds or not keeping track of your own health. And so at this point, it seems that this young man is not yet ready to disclose or discuss his substance use. And again, it takes a lot of trust for young people to disclose or confide in their health worker. And so the fact that there's care available for him in the facility, but also some efforts have been made into the community as well to reach him through peers. One thing to think about is to really extend that relationship and keep that relationship going, but also really stress the importance of confidentiality to him so that he feels more comfortable to disclose what's happening in his life. And while we're also working on his understanding of HIV and his adherence to his treatment, we also have to think about the other issues that may be coming up in his life. So at this age, he may or may not be sexually active. And with a high viral load and drug resistance, we want to make sure that he is protecting any of his partners. We know with an undetectable viral load that he's less likely to transmit the HIV virus onwards, but that's something that he also may be motivated by and understand. But in the meantime, it's also very important to talk to him about safe sex and condom use. So overall, I think this case really demonstrates the complexity of treating these children over the long term and into young adulthood and then into adulthood. So there's a lot of support needed. And I think it sounds like that support and so the relationship is building with this client, and that needs to continue. There needs to be trust established with him, and also to address these other issues that are coming up, such as substance use, and first and foremost, having him understand the outcomes of his substance use, and then also really understanding the other issues that may be coming up, including the need for education or work or some form of employment, and also thinking about his potential sexual activity. I think there was a couple comments in the chat box about the issue of broken families and how difficult this is in terms of conducting visits or keeping track of young people. And I think this is a huge issue that we also need to continue discussing.
So I think there's another question really around how do we strengthen disclosure, between the caregiver and the child. And really, I think what I do find often when I speak to caregivers is this reluctance, and usually it's out of and it's not it's a fear that they're going to harm their children or their their guardian who they're looking after. And I think it's just to get caregivers to understand that they're not putting their kids under it's not a negative thing. And from our experience, and I tell all my patients this every time, every adolescents I've ever spoken to, and we've had to disclose to them at a late stage, the first thing they asked is, why was I not told this earlier? And I I think it's just understanding that this breakdown in communication is a breakdown in trust. So it's very important both in terms of between ourselves as healthcare workers and the patient, but also in terms of the relationship between a parent and their child, is that trust needs to be there. And if that's broken, it becomes very difficult to, reestablish that. So I think it's just, making caregivers understand that that trust is part of that disclosure process, and that, we should not be, going lightly into trying to break that trust.
Thank you. Thank you both. Thank you. I don't see any more questions in the chat, but thank you so much for shedding a lot of light into how we can navigate some of the cases that we're seeing on a daily basis. And I mean, there's a lot, yes, there's drug resistance and there's treatment failure, but there's also a lot that we can do within our scope as health providers, enhanced adherence counseling, disclosure support, thinking about prevention. It's not just about the client that's in front of you, it's who else they is in their social circle. So lots to learn, and I'm not going to be the clinician here. I'll leave it to the experts. So I will, I think, switch back to our presenter number one, Joachim. I'm sure if you're still around and if you're ready to continue with your presentation. Thank you.
Boa tarde a todos. Eu sou o Joaquim, sou assistente médico de Muri, Moçambique, e vou apresentar o primeiro tema. Temos aqui a história médica da criança. O cliente tem 11 anos de idade, HIV positivo e em cuidados de tratamento desde outubro de 2017, quando tinha 6 anos de idade. No tempo de diagnóstico, ela não tinha sintomas e foi testada no mesmo dia com a mãe e recebeu o resultado positivo. Estava no estadio 1 da OMS, CD4 inicial, 70 estrelas, iniciou com a linha até contra moxazida. História médica. Em novembro de 2019, ela foi trocada para a ABC, Restecel, Lopinavir e Tonavir, baseado nas novas normas clínicas. Em janeiro de 2020, foi diagnosticada tuberculose pulmonar e terminou o tratamento da tuberculose pulmonar em julho de 2020. Em agosto de 2020, trocou de novo a linha para ABC 3TC mais DTG, baseado nas novas normas clínicas. Ela já fez testes de carga viral, mas nunca teve a supressão viral. Aqui temos o resumo da história clínica. Em outubro de 2017, tinha as análises de CD4 73. Em setembro de 2019, tinha análise de carga viral 7.794, logaritmo de 3,89. Em outubro de 2020, estava já no estadio 3, teve resultado de carga viral de 21.035 cópias por mililitro, logaritmo de 4,32. Em fevereiro de 2022, no estadio 3, teve resultado de carga viral de 99.270 cópias por mililitro, logaritmo de 5. Neste slide temos a história psicossocial. A criança, junto com a sua mãe, vem às consultas marcadas. Está em processo de revelação diagnóstica, recebe visitas domiciliares de apoio com a mãe mentora. A mãe é a cuidadora no mesmo dia que a criança e tem supressão viral. A mãe explica que nenhum fator de adesão foi identificado. Aqui mesmo neste slide estamos a ver uma foto do caminho da vida que a criança pintou. Caminho da vida é uma ferramenta de adesão que usamos em Moçambique. Questões para o painel de expertos. A primeira questão é: quais são as causas de falência virológica? A segunda questão é: o que podemos fazer neste caso? Obrigado.
Thank you very much. So I'm going to, I see Dr. Archery, I see you're still on. Would you like to say a few things quickly before you leave, or are you about to?
So maybe just to start off with, so again, I think the principle I wanted to make with the previous case is really around, we always get fixated on the need for like high level resistance panels to make a diagnosis. And if you look at this patient and how we sequence the drugs, we can, even if we do a resistance panel on this patient now, I'll guarantee you we'll probably be 90% correct. And if we look at what this child has been on, he was initially on AZT3 nevirapine, and Nandita spoke to you about earlier that with nevirapine, and this kid's been failing that, is likely to have developed high-level resistance to NNRTIs, so K103N and Y181C, and then unfortunately, he was switched to a Bacova 3-TC lopinavir ritonavir, and he developed TB treatment. He was put onto rifampicin. And we do know that with the rifampicin, if you don't boost that lopinavir ritonavir, you get suboptimal levels of the lopinavir ritonavir. So I think a lot of that resistance, that failure from that lopinavir ritonavir based regimen came from the unboosted PI that this patient was on while he was on TB treatment, and because of that, you're going to start getting some resistance to a Bacova and 3-TC as well. So you get the 184V mutation, and then either K65 or a 70R mutation for Bacova. So I do anticipate at this moment in time we've got some resistance, definitely 184 plus or minus a 70R, and so it's essentially the Bacova and the dolutegravir which is holding this regimen. And really the question is how much of that Bacova is still active because he was not on an optimal previous regimen. So I think, so the one thing is that even without a resistance test, you can kind of understand, what the likely mutation profiles are for this patient. So I think, that's really the reason why this patient has failed that regimen is one, I think we've because of that unboosted PI, he's developed some resistance to both the PI and also to that backbone regimen. The second thing is, I do think, this discrepancy between the mom's viral load and the child's viral load does indicate that there's something here, and this predated, this patient going on to a lopinavir ritonavir based regimen. So, this disclosure at 11 years of age should have happened a bit earlier. And I think that's something that, could have, that needs to be expedited really to get that child, on board with the treatment and, comfortable with taking the treatment. So, I think that's another thing that really needs to be emphasized. And the last thing I just wanted to mention was, the other thing that I often find is, we often very judgmental about, especially with a caregiver who's bringing a child who's unsuppressed. And, this mom is suppressed, and I assume she's doing as much as she can to ensure that this child is taking the treatment. So I think, in terms of the way in which we address the adherence problems, we need to make sure that the language we use is appropriate and that we don't add additional judgment to that language for the caregiver. And it's, that goes through both in terms of the way in which we speak to the patient, but the kind of advice that we give this child. And thirdly, I think moving to a once daily regimen and simplifying that treatment so that it's given at the same time as the mom is giving the treatment will go a long way in terms of improving that adherence and seeing what's happening here. So unfortunately, I have to drop off, but I'll leave you in the capable hands of Nandita to take you forward. Thanks.
Thank you,
I think
Dr.
I was muted. I apologize. was a great answer, and I agree with him on, again, I think when we approach caregivers, especially those that are not whose children are not doing well. I mean, it's very easy sometimes to blame the caregiver or to come across sort of in a critical way, and really that caregiver needs support. And just going through it and to think about sort of those questions of what causes treatment failure and what causes drug resistance, it really is when you don't have enough drugs in your system. So the HIV virus recognizes the drug, but isn't completely suppressed by it and learns to fight it. So anytime that your drug level in the body is lowered, it gives HIV the opportunity to develop resistance. And some of those things, and the majority of the time, the vast majority of the time, the issue is adherence. And so the drug levels are lower because children or adolescents or anyone may not be taking their treatment consistently. But there are other things that can also reduce your drug levels. I think Dr. Mo talked about drug-drug interactions, particularly between lopinavir, ritonavir, and TB treatment, which can lower the level of lopinavir, ritonavir in the body. And actually, I did see on that the summary that there was super boosting of lopinavir, ritonavir, where we add additional ritonavir to make sure that we account for the drug-drug interaction with the TB treatment. Now, that said, that's incredibly difficult to provide. And so some of the things that may happen with that and some of the other reasons that may be lowering drug level is just poor absorption of the drug. So whether a child has diarrhea or is vomiting or some other type of severe malnutrition where they're not absorbing the drug into their bloodstream, that may also lower drug levels and contribute to resistance. And then the last thing that actually we see, unfortunately, a little too often is dosing that has not been adjusted for age. And so I think it's really important to make sure that we've maximized everything we can do for this young girl to make sure that she is getting the appropriate drug levels. And so that means, talking about adherence, but also recognizing that this is a young girl who's been on lopinavir, ritonavir, and then not just lopinavir, ritonavir, but also super boosting. And for anyone who's ever given or prescribed lopinavir, ritonavir, you know that it's an incredibly difficult drug to give. Children don't like it. It tastes terrible. There are caregivers who don't even want to give it to their child and may just put it to the side and give the other drugs because it's a very challenging drug to take, regardless of the formulation. The syrup is foul tasting and needs to be refrigerated. When we have granules, the amount of granules are still very bitter. You have to take quite a bit, and she may not actually be taking the whole amount. So there are many reasons why she may not have suppressed using lopinavir, ritonavir and on that previous regimen. So I do want to say though that a few other things to look at is to think about the disclosure process. So this is again a young girl who is living with her mother, who's also taking treatment. She may not have been fully disclosed to. So I think that starting the disclosure process or investigating the disclosure process may really be helpful. And then I also want to say I applaud the clinical team for sort of assigning a mentor mother to visit the home and spend time with the family to really have a better understanding of what's happening. In the health facility, we just see what comes to the facility, but really everything is happening at home. And sometimes a mentor mother or an outreach worker or a case manager may actually have the real story of what's happening. So I think with more time and with having this relationship develop with more discussion and disclosure, that we'll hear more pieces of the story. But in the meantime, I think on our end as health workers, we need to do whatever we can to really maximize the way that these drugs are being used. So again, that's talking about adherence, and that's being done and supporting adherence through the process of disclosure and with a mentor mother, but also making sure there are no other drugs being given, and to think about whether she's taking the full amount, and also to lastly make sure that we're giving the correct dose. So those are my my thoughts on that case, but it was a very interesting case. And thank you for presenting.
Thank you, Nandita, and thank you, Joachim, for a very, very interesting case. Yeah, I'm sure we've all had a lesson or two from this. Nandita, I'm not sure if I may have missed, Laura's got a question in the chat box around, I'm just trying to look, why children take a long time to have viral load suppression compared with adults, even if they're on optimal regimens. I'm sure you may have covered that and I missed it, but could you speak to that if you haven't already?
That's actually a really good question. And I think some of us may remember in the past that we would always sort of give children a longer time to get to viral suppression. There are a couple of different reasons for this. Number one, in general, children tend to start out with a higher viral load. And we've seen this in infants. It just takes longer for the viral load to come down from that higher point. But also because it takes time to adjust. It takes time to make sure that we're on the right regimen at the right dose. And so for that reason, we often see sometimes that it takes a little bit longer. Now with dolutegravir and with some of the newer drugs that are more potent, I don't know that there's ever really been a comparison of how quickly the viral load drops in adults compared to children. That's an interesting question, so I'll find out. That may actually be more applicable to drugs that we used to use in the past that are not as potent as the drugs that we are using now. But overall, children do start out with a higher viral load before treatment, and that may be one reason for seeing that. But of course, there are other reasons, including sort of adjustment to the regimen and getting a schedule down for appropriate adherence. And this is why we sort of wait to do the viral load for at least 6 months to have passed before checking a viral load, just to make sure that we've given them enough time.
Excellent. Thank you, Nandita. And I think we're doing just about okay with time, despite our visitors. So I'm going to move to our last presenter now, and that is Atienne Matongo from Zambia. And Atienne is presenting what we had thought would be a really good case to share as a best practice case. And while Ationgo is coming on and getting ready, Nandita, I don't know, would you mind answering Kim's question in the chat box? You can just maybe respond directly in the chat box. Otherwise, over to you, Atienne.
Good afternoon. I'm Atienne Matongo, presenting from Zambia, Cafe Estes Clinic, in conjunction with PRICO, that is Pride Community Health Organization. I'm presenting you a case on the child who was tested positive through provider initiative testing and counseling at the age of 1 year. She was tested positive on the 27th of December, 2018, and then treated for OIs. OIs, I mean the child had a bit of malnutrition and was commenced on ART on the 19th of January, 2019. She was commenced on the first-line regimen of abacavir, lamivudine, and lopinavir, and syrup, which was Calitra, and Ceftriaxone. The child is now 4 years old. The father is not working. The mother is on informal hairdresser. The initial labs investigations were done. The first one was done on the 8th of November, 2019, and the CD4 count was 1,715 cells per mil. And it was at the viral load, the CD4 percentage was at 15%. On the 20th of May, 2020, we repeated the CD4 count, which was 1,160 cells per mil, and the CD4 percentage was at 4%. On 24th November, 2021, we had tested again the CD4 count. The cells were 1,487, and the CD4 cells was, the percentage was at 23%. Now we're looking at the viral load, which was done on the days which are following. On 25th of November, 2020, we did the first viral load, which was 34,340 copies. Then on 20th January 2021, the CD was 54,300 copies, and we repeated in the interval of 3 months. We tested the girl again on 20th April 2021, and it was 50,172. And at this age, if you see the viral load on 24th of November 2020, no, I think this is a mistake, supposed to be 24th of November 2021, she had the copies which was 0 suppressed. And what happened here, on the same date of 20th of, in September 2021, the child was switched to loperamide granules from the Caritra. We switched the child on September 2021 to loperamide granules, and the repeat viral load was done when we have the results 0 copies in November 2021. The child was suppressed in November 2021. On the 3rd March 2022, the child was switched now, transitioned to abacavir, lamivudine, and pediatric dolutegravir, is currently responding well. The most recent viral load is showing 0 copies again when we repeated. The child is now able to take medication without any difficulties. The challenges which we faced on this child was not able to swallow Caritra. As you know that the test was bad, the test was bitter and spilled it out. The nutrition status was a challenge as well. Later, the challenge was sorted out through the support of the community partner, which is Pride Community Health Organization, who provided the food supplements. At the moment, the child is now on the child was suppressed using the loperamide and DTG regimen, has addressed it to solve the problem of treatment optional. At the moment, the child continues on the abacavir, lamivudine, and dolutegravir, and the child is doing well. Now I have the questions for my experts. Was it correct to move the child to pediatric dolutegravir when she was doing well on the loperamide granules? But the other thing, that the caregiver was anxious, not waiting to change the child, not wanting the child to change to the better regimen just after a short time or period. How would you convince to prepare the caregiver better when transitioning the treatment? The third question is, sometimes the nurses have also not been trained on the new guidelines and not confident to switch out the child without the doctor. How would you address that for us nurses? The next step. Oh, thank you. I submit.
Great, thank you so much for that case. And again, it's a success story in this example, but still kind of raises some interesting questions and some important questions that I think many of us with this transition to pediatric dolutegravir have been struggling with. So I think that question of, if a child is doing well and virally suppressed on their current regimen, should we change it? I think for a long time we've learned that we should leave it as it is, because what if we need that next drug for the second line? And I think things have been changing. And so, you know, a lot of this depends on the national program. So I don't want to give advice that goes against the national program in your country, because every country is at a different point. However, what we do know is that most countries are in the process of transitioning all patients to dolutegravir. The speed at which they're doing that may differ. And so I would advise strongly to check on the requirements before going through this. But that said, as we've talked about, dolutegravir is a potent drug, and now with the 10 milligram scored dispersible tablet, it's very easy to take, and it's very tolerable compared to Kaletra. So I want to point out as well that when we taken this child's viral load. A viral load is really one point in time. So if you measured a viral load and the results come back, it really measured the viral load at that point in time. And so there may be variation along the way, which is important when you take, this is why we do viral load repeatedly, right, over time to make sure that we're seeing it maintained at viral suppression. And so, one thing to consider as well is, again, lopinavir ritonavir is not an easy drug to take. This mother obviously had issues initially with the liquid, which we know has its challenges. But even though she has finally had her child suppressed using the granules, we still know that that's not an easy formulation to take. And as this child grows, the volume of granules or the number of packets she's going to have to take will go on increasing. And it may become harder for her in the longer run. So one thing to talk to this mother about, and again, I could also understand this mother's hesitation after wanting to get to viral suppression for her daughter and reaching it. I can understand why she would hesitate to change, but it's important in that case to sort of explain to her your rationale that this is the right thing to do now because it's going to be much easier for her in the long run, and that she won't have to go through the difficulties of taking a drug that is difficult to take. And that might be helpful to the mother. You can also share if you've had experiences with other clients doing well on dolutegravir. And so really many times caregivers will depend on your confidence when you're counseling them. So, I can appreciate the last question as well. If nurses are not feeling confident to change regimens, we do really need to think about our training a little bit. I think part of what, as much as we're here to provide sort of advice and guidance, it's very important for us to also hear from all of you on what the questions are, or what is kind of causing that lack of confidence, and how can we better adjust our training or our mentoring to make sure that we're answering the questions to give you that confidence. Pediatric treatment for children living with HIV has become very complicated, had been very complicated. I'll say it's becoming more simplified now, and we're hoping as it becomes easier when the formulations and the drugs that we use and the adherence and the formulations that are easier to adhere to, that it won't be so challenging, it won't be so intimidating to treat children with living with HIV. And so I would encourage you to continue asking your questions, and really even in the chat now or following the chat, we have a platform where we can submit questions. I would encourage you all to ask your questions so that we can make sure we're addressing correctly and answering to your needs. And I think Agnes, do you want me to just sort of share some final thoughts before turning over to you?
Would you please, Nandita, please go ahead.
Of course.
And then I'll close after that.
Great. And so just in the last, in the bit of time we have together, I think these cases really were very illustrative of what challenges we're facing on the ground. And again, it's very important for us to keep that kind of communication lines open so that those of us who are trying to teach or develop materials or write guidelines understand what the questions are that you're facing every day. But going back to sort of just where we are at this point with HIV treatment is that our paradigms, or sort of the old things that we've learned 10 years ago, or even 5 years ago, or no longer, apply always. So things are changing, and we have to, kind of get used to that idea as well, that we're trying our best to make treatment options simpler. So in the past, many of you remember, we used to go from AZT to either abacavir or tenofovir and vice versa. Those things are starting to change now as we have more potent drugs like lopinavir, ritonavir, and dolutegravir. And we are also understanding something a little bit more about resistance. But this is where viral load comes in. And I mentioned in the previous case that viral load gives us a snapshot of what's happening at that moment that the blood is drawn. But after that, we may or may not know. And so what's really critical here is to make sure that we're looking at viral load measurements over time. So every country has a schedule for when we send viral load. So for routine, when a child is doing well, we check a viral load every 6 months or once a year based on your national, your program recommendations, but we just make sure that it's okay. And if we see a problem, that's when we investigate, we start more in-depth adherence counseling, we look for where the problems are, and we check again a little bit sooner. And it's actually very helpful to see viral loads as they progress over time. And it tells you a little bit about the story of that child. You know, I think in one of the cases we saw a young man who had been on a failing regimen for probably 10 years. And that already gave us an idea of what type of resistance patterns we may be seeing. So again, we need to make sure that we're documenting these viral loads. We're sending them regularly and when they're due. And I know we often see in many programs that there are challenges with sending viral loads regularly, or even just getting the results of the viral load tests. So I think we need to be a little bit more careful about this and making sure that every child is getting a viral load when they're due for viral load, that we're following up on the results as well. There's very often, I will see in a chart that there's a failing viral load, there's a failing viral load, there's a failing viral load, and it will go on for months or even years sometimes without really being addressed. And so I know it's very frustrating when results don't come back or reagents are stocked out, but I think viral load is really a tool that we can use to uncover some of the challenges that we're still facing. So I would encourage all of you to pay careful attention to that and to make sure that we're documenting this clearly, because at some point that will give somebody the full story that they need. And I think that was an important point to me in this, you know, through these cases, is that, you know, the presenters really researched these cases. They knew the history, they knew the context, and they knew what was happening with these children. And I think that's something that we really also need to focus on. In this last case, we heard about there being nutritional support that was available in the community. We were hearing about peer support or mentor mothers. And sometimes, again, at the facility or within a program, it's easy to forget, or because it's not right in front of us, that there are a lot of resources in the community that can be helpful to our clients. And so I just want to make another case for, you know, when we're at a program or at a facility level, it's important to already also be aware of what's happening in the community to make sure that we're all working together to provide every client with what they need. And so with that, what I'm going to do is turn over to Agnes for some closing comments, and then we'll share the pediatric dolutegravir video with the group. But thank you very much. It was a pleasure to be here.
Thank you, Nandita. Yeah, so first of all, just a huge thank you to all our health providers who put a lot of effort into these cases. We initially looked at them and we thought, oh, they're not that complex, but I can't believe the amount of conversation that has gone on. And thank you for your questions as well to facilitate the learning. I would also like to thank our panelists, Nandita and Dr. Moore, who's unfortunately had to step off. And lastly, thank you to all our audience for persisting and staying on. With that, I'm going to close just to say that the video recording of the session will be available on our social media platforms, as well as our Linking and Learning Hub. And then with that, we're going to close with a video, which is a video on managing ART transition and providing effective caregiver support and treatment literacy. You still access the video on our platforms. So thank you, everyone, and thanks for your participation.
Yeah.